On the morning of December 17, 1944, 3 men in United States Army uniforms were apprehended at a military police checkpoint near the Belgian commune of Aywaille. Within hours, their interrogation would trigger the most widespread counterintelligence panic in American military history. These men were members of Panzer Brigade 150, a specialized German commando unit operating behind Allied lines in violation of the Hague Convention's regulations governing land warfare. Their capture exposed Operation Greif, a deception campaign that would temporarily paralyze Allied command structures during the critical opening phase of Germany's Ardennes offensive. If you appreciate detailed, evidence-based World War II history that examines primary sources and military records, please like this video and subscribe to the channel. Leave a comment telling us where you're watching from today. The origins of this infiltration operation trace to October 22, 1944, when Adolf Hitler convened a restricted planning session at the Wolfschanze headquarters complex in Rastenburg, East Prussia. Present at this meeting was SS Obersturmbannführer Otto Skorzeny, commander of SS Sonderverband zum Beibefehl Friedenthal, a special operations unit specializing in unconventional warfare. Skorzeny had established his reputation in September 1943 by leading the Gran Sasso raid that extracted Italian dictator Benito Mussolini from captivity at the Campo Imperatore Hotel. More recently, in October 1944, his commandos had conducted Operation Panzerfaust, kidnapping the son of Hungarian regent Miklos Horthy to prevent Hungary's defection from the Axis alliance. Hitler's briefing outlined Wacht am Rhein, later designated Herbstnebel by operational planners, the Wehrmacht's planned counter-offensive through the Ardennes forest sector. German intelligence assessments, compiled by the Fremde Heere West under Oberst IG Alexis von Roener, had identified the Ardennes as the weakest point in Allied defensive positions. 4 American divisions, the 28th, 99th, 106th Infantry Divisions, and 14th Cavalry Group, were thinly deployed across an 80-mile front in terrain deemed unsuitable for major offensive operations by Allied planners. The strategic objective was ambitious. German armored spearheads would penetrate Allied lines, cross the Meuse River between Liège and Namur, and advance northwest to recapture the port of Antwerp. This would split the 21st Army Group under Field Marshal Bernard Montgomery from the 12th Army Group, commanded by General Omar Bradley, recreating the strategic success of the May 1940 campaign that had led to the Dunkirk evacuation. Hitler anticipated that such a catastrophic defeat would fracture the Anglo-American alliance and force the Western Allies to negotiate a separate peace. For the offensive to succeed, German forces required rapid exploitation of the initial breakthrough. The Meuse bridges represented critical infrastructure. If Allied engineers demolished these crossings, German mechanized units would be immobilized while Allied reinforcements arrived. Hitler determined that conventional reconnaissance elements would be insufficient to secure these objectives before demolition charges could be detonated. The solution was unconventional warfare conducted by infiltrators disguised as Allied personnel. Skorzeny later testified in his 1947 war crimes trial that he had expressed reservations about the legal implications of this mission. The Hague Convention respecting the laws and customs of war on land, specifically Article 23F, prohibited treachery, but did not explicitly address the use of enemy uniforms during infiltration operations. However, customary international law and military legal precedent held that combatants captured while wearing enemy uniforms forfeited their status as lawful combatants and could be executed as spies or Francs-tireurs. According to Skorzeny's testimony, Hitler dismissed these concerns with the assertion that German commandos would change into Wehrmacht uniforms before engaging in combat operations. This distinction, infiltration versus combat in enemy uniform, would later become central to Skorzeny's legal defense. However, declassified records from the subsequent military tribunals indicate that operational orders for Panzer Brigade 150 made no such requirement, and captured infiltrators were armed and prepared to fight while dressed as American personnel. The organizational directive for Panzer Brigade 150 was issued by Oberkommando der Wehrmacht on October 25, 1944. just 3 days after Hitler's meeting with Skorzeny. The initial personnel requisition called for 3,300 volunteers with fluent English language capability, preferably individuals with experience in English-speaking countries or captured personnel from British Commonwealth forces who had agreed to collaborate. The results fell dramatically short of requirements. By early November, approximately 2,500 personnel had reported to the brigade's training area near Grafenwöhr in Bavaria. Of these, fewer than 10 possessed native-level English fluency. A further 30-40 could conduct basic conversations with noticeable German accents. The majority of the brigade's enlisted personnel knew only elementary phrases, affirmative and negative responses, apologies, and simple directional terms. Military efficiency reports filed by Skorzeny's staff officers documented this linguistic deficiency as a critical operational vulnerability. The proposed solution was tactically crude. Personnel with inadequate English skills were instructed to feign acute gastrointestinal distress if questioned by American military police. This deception would theoretically explain their inability to communicate effectively and create an impression of urgency that might discourage extended interrogation. The equipment situation proved equally problematic. Skorzeny's requisition specified American-manufactured vehicles and weapons to ensure authenticity during infiltration operations. The Wehrmacht's Quartermaster Corps managed to provide a limited number of captured M4 Sherman medium tanks, M8 Greyhound armored cars, and Willys MB jeeps seized during earlier campaigns. However, these authentic vehicles were insufficient for the brigade's needs. German armored workshops attempted to disguise Panther Ausfuhr G medium tanks as American M10 tank destroyers by removing the Panther's distinctive cupola, modifying the hull profile, and applying olive drab paint with white star markings. These conversions, designated Ersatz M10, were superficially convincing at distance or in low-light conditions, but would not withstand close inspection by personnel familiar with American armored vehicles. The weight, engine sound, track pattern, and dimensions remained distinctly German. Uniform procurement presented similar challenges. The brigade required complete American uniform sets, including M1941 field jackets, wool trousers, leggings, boots, helmets, and unit insignia. Supply officers gathered these items from multiple sources: clothing stripped from American prisoners of war, uniforms taken from battlefield casualties, and garments purchased through neutral intermediaries in Switzerland and Sweden. Contemporary photographs from the brigade's training period show significant variation in uniform condition and authenticity. Some personnel wore well-fitted, regulation American uniforms with appropriate rank insignia and unit patches. Others were issued mismatched combinations, a field jacket from one division paired with trousers from another, or enlisted uniforms worn with officers' insignia. Several sets retained bloodstains from their previous owners, a detail that troubled some personnel according to post-war interviews. The training curriculum emphasized cultural immersion beyond mere language instruction. Brigade personnel studied American military organization, rank structures, and operational procedures. They memorized the organization of infantry divisions, the composition of armored combat commands, and the chain of command from squad level to Army Group headquarters. Mock interrogations tested their ability to provide plausible responses about their fictional units, home states, and military service records. Cultural education extended to civilian knowledge that might arise during checkpoint questioning. Personnel studied American geography, focusing on state capitals, major cities, and regional characteristics. They learned the rules of baseball, the names of prominent professional teams, and recent World Series results. Hollywood cinema served as both entertainment and educational material. Brigade members watched American films to study accents, mannerisms, and cultural references. Particular attention was devoted to behavioral authenticity. German military bearing, rigid posture, formal salutes, and precise movements differed markedly from the more casual deportment of American enlisted personnel. Brigade members practiced walking with a relaxed gait, standing in informal postures, and executing the less formal American salute. They studied the American practice of chewing gum, smoking while on duty, and addressing officers with less formality than Wehrmacht protocol required. Weapons training focused on American small arms. The M1 Garand semi-automatic rifle, M1 carbine, M3 grease gun, submachine gun, and M1911A1 pistol. However, captured American weapons were insufficient for the entire brigade. Many infiltrators were issued British Sten submachine guns captured in earlier campaigns, a decision that would contribute to their eventual exposure. The Ardennes offensive commenced at 0530 hours on December 16, 1944, when German artillery positions opened fire along an 80-mile front stretching from Monschau in the north to Echternach in the south. This preparatory bombardment, involving over 1,600 guns and Nebelwerfer rocket launchers, targeted American forward positions, communication centers, and suspected command posts. 3 German armies participated in the assault. In the northern sector, the 6th Panzer Army under SS Oberstgruppenführer Josef Sepp Dietrich was tasked with the primary breakthrough operation. This force included the 1st SS Panzer Division Leibstandarte SS Adolf Hitler and the 12th SS Panzer Division Hitlerjugend, elite formations with priority for fuel, ammunition, and replacement personnel. Their objective was to cross the Meuse River between Liège and Huy, then drive northwest toward Antwerp. The center sector was assigned to the 5th Panzer Army, commanded by General der Panzertruppe Hasso von Manteuffel. This army included the 2nd Panzer Division, 116th Panzer Division, and Panzer Lehr Division. Manteuffel's forces were to cross the Meuse between Namur and Dinant, providing the southern pincer of the encirclement operation. The southern sector was held by the 7th Army under General der Panzertruppe Erich Brandenberger. This primarily infantry force was assigned a defensive mission to establish blocking positions along the southern flank to prevent American 3rd Army reinforcements from interfering with the main offensive. The initial assault achieved substantial tactical success. The 106th Infantry Division, newly arrived in the sector with minimal combat experience, found itself surrounded in the Schnee-Eifel region within 48 hours. 2 entire regiments, the 422nd and 423rd Infantry, would surrender on December 19th, representing one of the largest American capitulations in the European theater. Into this chaos, Panzer Brigade 150's infiltration teams deployed. Organized into small units of 3 to 4 men per vehicle, these commandos crossed the front lines, hidden within the main German advance. Operational orders directed them to penetrate 15-30 kilometers behind American lines and conduct specific missions. Reconnaissance of Meuse River crossings, disruption of communication networks, misdirection of Allied reinforcements, and psychological warfare operations. Contemporary intelligence reports from American V Corps documented the initial effectiveness of these operations. Infiltrators successfully misdirected a supply convoy from the 7th Armored Division, sending it down secondary roads that delayed its arrival at St. Vith by several critical hours. Other teams cut telephone cables connecting divisional headquarters to forward regiments, temporarily disrupting Allied command and control. Several reconnaissance parties reached the Meuse River and transmitted intelligence about bridge conditions and defensive preparations back to German forward headquarters. The most effective contribution was psychological. Infiltrators spread false reports of German breakthroughs that had not occurred, claiming that Kampfgruppe Peiper had already crossed the Meuse, or that American positions at Malmedy had been overrun. These rumors, passed to American units by men in American uniforms driving American vehicles, created confusion about the actual disposition of German forces and complicated Allied efforts to establish coherent defensive lines. However, the operation's success was constrained by factors beyond Skorzeny's control. The main German offensive failed to achieve its timetable. Fierce resistance at Elsenborn Ridge by the 2nd and 99th Infantry Divisions prevented the 6th Panzer Army from exploiting its initial breakthrough. At St. Vith, American forces, including the 7th Armored Division and elements of the 106th Infantry Division, established a defensive position that held for 6 days, denying German forces use of critical road networks. Without rapid forward progress by conventional forces, Panzer Brigade 150's infiltrators became isolated deep behind American lines, with diminishing chances of linking up with advancing German units or accomplishing their bridge seizure missions. The exposure of Operation Greif began at approximately 07:30 hours on December 17, 1944, at a military police checkpoint near Aywaille, Belgium, located approximately 30 kilometers southwest of Liège. This checkpoint was manned by personnel from the 291st Engineer Combat Battalion, which had been tasked with rear area security duties as combat engineer units were reassigned to defensive positions. Staff Sergeant William Creel, a military policeman with the 291st, observed a Willys Jeep approaching the checkpoint from the direction of the front lines. The vehicle carried 3 men in American military uniforms with appropriate rank insignia and unit patches. Initial visual inspection revealed no immediate irregularities. The vehicle bore correct markings, and the occupants appeared to be a standard reconnaissance patrol. However, Creel had attended a briefing 24 hours earlier, at which battalion intelligence officers had warned about the possibility of German infiltrators. This warning was based on captured German documents found on an officer from the 3rd Parachute Division, which made reference to special units operating in American uniform. The briefing had instructed military police to be vigilant for soldiers who could not answer basic challenge questions or whose equipment showed inconsistencies. Creel initiated a routine challenge procedure, requesting the daily password. The 3 men hesitated before responding, and their spoken English contained pronunciation irregularities that Creel found suspicious. He ordered them to exit the vehicle for detailed inspection. During this inspection, Creel observed that the men were armed with British Sten Mark II submachine guns rather than standard American weapons. This discrepancy was significant. While captured enemy weapons were sometimes carried by American units, it was unusual for an entire patrol to be uniformly equipped with non-regulation arms. Additionally, the soldiers' uniform details showed inconsistencies, mismatched unit patches, incorrect collar insignia for their stated ranks, and boots that did not match American military issue patterns. When Creel began questioning the men about their unit assignments and home states, their answers contained factual errors. One claimed to be from the 5th Armored Division, but could not name its commander or correctly describe its divisional insignia. Another stated he was from Oregon, but could not name its capital city. Within minutes, Creel placed all 3 men under arrest. A thorough search revealed German military identification papers concealed in hidden pockets of their uniforms. Beneath their American field jackets, they wore German Wehrmacht field grey tunics. The arrested men were identified as Unteroffizier Manfred Pernas, Obergefreiter Günther Billing, and Gefreiter Wilhelm Schmidt, all members of Panzer Brigade 150. The prisoners were immediately transported to 1st Army headquarters for interrogation by Counterintelligence Corps personnel. Under questioning, the captured infiltrators provided detailed information about Operation Greif, including the size of Panzer Brigade 150, its training procedures, and most critically, its objectives. Military intelligence reports from this interrogation indicate that the prisoners exaggerated certain aspects of their mission, whether through genuine confusion, deliberate misinformation, or coercion, remains unclear in declassified records. One prisoner stated that the ultimate objective was the assassination of Supreme Allied Commander General Dwight Eisenhower. While no documentary evidence from German sources confirms this claim, the statement triggered immediate security responses at Supreme Headquarters Allied Expeditionary Force, SHAF. Other captured infiltrators claimed that dozens of additional teams remained operational behind Allied lines, though the actual number was likely fewer than 20. News of the Aywaille capture spread rapidly through Allied command channels. By the afternoon of December 17th, 1st Army had distributed security warnings to all subordinate units, alerting them to the presence of German infiltrators in American uniform. By December 18th, these warnings had reached 12th Army Group and SHAF headquarters. The response at SHAF was extraordinary. General Eisenhower, who typically maintained an accessible command style that involved frequent visits to frontline units, was placed under virtual house arrest at the Trianon Palace Hotel in Versailles. Security personnel from the 2nd Armored Division and additional military police units established a defensive perimeter around the headquarters. Eisenhower's movements were restricted to essential activities, and his scheduled inspection tour of forward units was cancelled. Contemporary accounts from SHAEF staff officers describe an atmosphere of extreme suspicion. All personnel entering headquarters buildings were subject to detailed identity verification regardless of rank. Even senior officers with established credentials underwent repeated checks. The Supreme Commander himself reportedly chafed at these restrictions, but complied with security recommendations. Throughout the American rear areas, military police checkpoints proliferated at road intersections, bridges, and approaches to command posts. These checkpoints implemented increasingly elaborate verification procedures that went beyond standard password challenges. Drawing on the understanding that German infiltrators might have memorized military information but would lack deep cultural knowledge, American MPs began asking questions designed to test authentic American identity. The questions varied by checkpoint but followed common patterns. Geography. What is the capital of Illinois? Name 3 states on the Atlantic coast. What river flows through Pittsburgh? Sports. Who won the 1944 World Series? Name 3 teams in the National League. What position did Babe Ruth play? Popular culture. Who is Mickey Mouse's girlfriend? Name 3 Betty Grable films. What radio show features Jack Benny? These improvised interrogations produced numerous false positives. General Omar Bradley, commander of the 12th Army Group, was temporarily detained when a military policeman refused to believe that Springfield, rather than Chicago, was Illinois' capital. British liaison officers were held for extended periods because they could not answer questions about American baseball teams or Hollywood actors. Tank crews from replacement units, fresh from training in the United States and unfamiliar with their new divisional assignments, were arrested because they could not correctly describe their unit's combat history. The cumulative effect was severe disruption of Allied logistical operations. Convoys carrying ammunition, fuel, and rations to forward units were delayed for hours at checkpoints while drivers underwent interrogation. Reinforcement columns moved at drastically reduced speed as each vehicle was individually checked. Staff officers attempting to reach command conferences arrived late or not at all. Radio communications increased dramatically as units attempted to bypass the paralyzed road network, creating additional burdens on already strained signal infrastructure. Military police reports from this period document the paranoia that gripped rear area personnel. Any soldier with an unusual accent, including Americans from regions with distinctive dialects, came under suspicion. Personnel who answered questions sarcastically or who expressed irritation at repeated checks were sometimes placed under temporary arrest until their identities could be verified through their parent units. Several incidents involved soldiers who failed to answer trivia questions correctly simply because they were poorly educated or uninterested in popular culture. A private from rural Alabama was detained because he could not name the 1944 World Series winner. He had never followed baseball. Another soldier from a fundamentalist religious background was held because he could not identify Mickey Mouse's girlfriend. His family had forbidden cartoon entertainment as frivolous. Despite the Allied counterintelligence panic, Panzer Brigade 140's actual operational achievements were limited. Declassified German after-action reports and post-war interrogations of surviving brigade personnel provide a detailed assessment of the infiltration campaign's effectiveness. Approximately 44 infiltration teams, each consisting of 3 to 4 men in 1 or 2 vehicles, successfully penetrated American lines during the initial phase of the offensive. These teams operated independently without centralized command and control, relying on pre-mission briefings that provided specific objectives and areas of operation. Documented successes include the misdirection of at least 3 American supply convoys, causing delays of 4 to 8 hours, the cutting of telephone cables at 7 locations, temporarily disrupting communications between regimental and divisional headquarters, the provision of tactical intelligence about American defensive positions and the location of fuel dumps, and the spread of rumors that contributed to Allied uncertainty about German force dispositions. However, none of the infiltration teams achieved their primary mission objectives. No Meuse River bridges were captured intact. No critical road junctions were held for advancing German forces. The reconnaissance intelligence provided was largely redundant with information gathered by conventional Wehrmacht reconnaissance units. The psychological impact, the widespread paranoia that paralyzed Allied rear areas, was unintended and emerged organically from the Aywaille capture rather than from systematic infiltrator actions. Ironically, the 3 men captured on December 17th contributed more to Operation Greif's effects than the teams that remained operational. Most infiltration teams were captured within 48 to 72 hours of crossing Allied lines. American counterintelligence procedures improved rapidly as MPs learned to recognize suspicious indicators, mismatched uniform components, non-standard weapons, hesitant responses to trivia questions, and behavioral traits inconsistent with American military culture. By December 21st, First Army intelligence estimated that all infiltration teams had been either captured or forced to abandon their missions and attempt to return to German lines. Several teams discarded their American uniforms and attempted to pass as refugees or displaced civilians with limited success. Others changed back into Wehrmacht uniforms and attempted to fight their way through Allied positions as conventional combatants, usually resulting in their deaths or capture. Skorzeny himself, commanding the brigade's conventional armored elements, participated in combat operations near Malmedy on December 21st, 22nd. His forces, now openly identified as German units, engaged elements of the 30th Infantry Division but failed to achieve any significant penetration. On December 28th, Skorzeny was wounded by artillery fragmentation near Ligneville and evacuated to a rear area hospital. He resumed duties in January 1945, but Panzer Brigade 150 was disbanded, its remaining personnel distributed to conventional SS units. The captured members of Panzer Brigade 150 faced immediate legal proceedings under the authority of First Army's Judge Advocate General Section. The legal framework was established by the Hague Convention respecting the laws and customs of war on land, particularly Article 29, which defined spies, and the customary international law prohibition against perfidy in warfare. American military legal officers determined that German personnel captured while wearing American uniforms had forfeited their status as lawful combatants. Unlike prisoners of war, who were entitled to protection under the Geneva Convention and could only be held until hostilities concluded, these infiltrators were classified as francs-tireurs, unlawful combatants subject to summary execution. However, American military justice procedures required formal trials even for francs-tireurs. Courts-martial were convened at First Army headquarters in Liège under the authority of Lieutenant General Courtney Hodges, the Army commander. The tribunals consisted of field-grade officers with legal training, supported by Judge Advocate General personnel who ensured procedural compliance. The first trial convened on December 21st, 1944. Defendants Manfred Pernas, Günther Billing, and Wilhelm Schmidt were charged with violation of the laws of war through combat while wearing enemy uniform. The prosecution presented physical evidence. The American uniforms found on the defendants, their German military identification papers, weapons inconsistent with American equipment, and their own statements during interrogation acknowledging their membership in Panzer Brigade 150. The defense, provided by captured German officers with legal training, argued that the defendants had not engaged in combat while wearing American uniform. They had been captured before any hostile action occurred. This distinction was legally significant. Wearing enemy uniform for infiltration or espionage purposes might be treated differently than wearing enemy uniform during actual combat. The tribunal rejected this defense, ruling that the defendants were armed, had penetrated American lines with hostile intent, and were prepared to engage in combat while disguised. Their capture before firing weapons was circumstantial rather than exculpatory. The court found all 3 defendants guilty and sentenced them to death by firing squad. On December 23, 1944, at 800 hours, the sentences were carried out at Henri-Chapelle, Belgium. The condemned men were offered religious services, which they accepted. They were blindfolded and executed by firing squad composed of soldiers from the 30th Infantry Division. Military observers recorded that all 3 men maintained military bearing and refused to appeal for clemency. Additional tribunals followed rapidly. Between December 23rd and December 31st, 13 more members of Panzer Brigade 150 were tried under similar charges. All were convicted and executed. The legal precedent was clear. Wearing enemy uniform during wartime, regardless of whether actual combat occurred, constituted perfidy under international law and merited capital punishment. These proceedings differed significantly from major war crimes trials conducted after the war's conclusion. The tribunals during the Ardennes campaign were conducted under field conditions with expedited procedures justified by operational necessity. Defense resources were minimal, appeals processes were truncated, and executions followed swiftly after conviction. Several captured infiltrators escaped trial by convincingly claiming they had been coerced into participation. Others who had removed their American uniforms before capture and fought as regular Wehrmacht soldiers were treated as conventional prisoners of war rather than francs-tireurs. The distinction depended on the specific circumstances of capture and the presence or absence of enemy uniform components. Otto Skorzeny remained in American custody after Germany's surrender in May 1945. In 1947, he was brought before a military tribunal at Dachau to face charges of violating the laws of war through his command of Operation Greif. The prosecution argued that Skorzeny had organized and directed an operation that knowingly violated the Hague Convention by deploying combatants in enemy uniform. The trial attracted significant attention from military legal experts because it would establish precedent for the treatment of special operations forces in future conflicts. The fundamental question was whether wearing enemy uniform constituted perfidy per se, or whether perfidy required the additional element of engaging in combat, while so disguised. The prosecution presented evidence of Skorzeny's command authority over Panzer Brigade 150, the operational orders directing infiltration in American uniform, and testimony from surviving brigade members confirming that they had been prepared to fight while disguised. The prosecution emphasized that 16 infiltrators had been convicted and executed for these actions, and that Skorzeny bore command responsibility. The defense strategy was novel. Skorzeny's legal team located a former British Special Operations Executive Officer, Wing Commander Forrest Yeo Thomas, who had conducted operations in occupied France, and called him as a defense witness. Yeo Thomas testified that Allied Special Operations Forces had routinely worn German uniforms during infiltration missions behind enemy lines. He provided specific examples of operations in which British commandos had dressed as Wehrmacht personnel to reach their objectives. This testimony established that the practice of wearing enemy uniform for infiltration was not exclusively German. The defense then emphasized the distinction between infiltration and combat. Skorzeny's operational orders, according to the defense, explicitly required personnel to change into German uniform before engaging in hostile action. The men executed during the Battle of the Bulge had been captured before they could comply with this directive. The tribunal's ruling was legally significant. The court determined that wearing enemy uniform for the purpose of infiltration, without engaging in combat while so disguised, did not constitute perfidy under international law. The prohibition applied specifically to engaging in hostile action while wearing enemy uniform, not merely to the act of disguise itself. Since the prosecution could not prove that Skorzeny's orders explicitly authorized combat in American uniform, the court found insufficient grounds for conviction. On September 9, 1947, Skorzeny was acquitted of all charges related to Operation Greif. The verdict created a legal paradox. 16 men had been executed for participating in an operation whose commander was subsequently found not guilty of ordering illegal action. This discrepancy reflected the difference between field tribunals conducted during active combat and formal war crimes trials conducted under peacetime conditions with full due process protections. The ruling established important precedent for post-World War II military law. NATO forces subsequently developed doctrine permitting infiltration in enemy uniform, provided that personnel changed into proper uniform before engaging in combat. Special operations forces in later conflicts, Korea, Vietnam, and subsequent wars, operated under regulations derived partly from the Skorzeny precedent. From a purely tactical perspective, Operation Greif failed comprehensively. None of its primary objectives were achieved. No bridges were captured, no critical infrastructure was secured, and the Meuse River remained under Allied control throughout the Ardennes campaign. The 16 infiltrators executed represented a higher casualty rate relative to operational gains than virtually any other German special operation of the war. However, the operation's psychological and operational impacts extended far beyond its tactical results. The paranoia generated by the infiltration campaign disrupted Allied logistics and command functions for over a week during a critical phase of the battle. Thousands of man-hours were consumed in checkpoint interrogations. Supply movements were delayed, command decisions were postponed as senior officers struggled to reach meetings through the congested checkpoint system. Military historians examining declassified records have debated whether this disruption significantly affected the battle's outcome. Some analysts argue that the delays in American reinforcement movements during December 17th to 20 allowed German forces to consolidate positions that might otherwise have been quickly overrun. Others contend that the primary factors determining the battle's outcome, German fuel shortages, American resistance at key strongpoints like Bastogne, and the rapid Allied response once initial confusion cleared, would have operated regardless of the infiltration campaign. What is documented is the long-term impact on American military intelligence and security procedures. The Ardennes experience demonstrated that cultural knowledge, sport trivia, entertainment references, regional geography could serve as authentication mechanisms more reliable than formal identification documents which could be forged. This recognition influenced Cold War counterintelligence training, which emphasized cultural fluency as both an operational necessity for deep cover agents and a verification tool for detecting enemy infiltrators. The improvised checkpoint questioning methods developed during the Ardennes campaign became formalized doctrine. Post-war military police training included instruction on culturally specific authentication questions appropriate for detecting infiltrators. During the Korean War and subsequently in Vietnam, American forces employed similar techniques to identify enemy personnel attempting to infiltrate positions by disguising themselves as South Korean or South Vietnamese personnel. The operation also influenced international legal discussions about the laws of armed conflict. The tension between Skorzeny's acquittal and the execution of his subordinates prompted legal scholars to seek greater precision in defining perfidy. The 1977 Additional Protocol 1 to the Geneva Conventions included specific provisions addressing deception in warfare, distinguishing between legitimate ruses and prohibited perfidy. Article 39 explicitly permits ruses of war, including wearing enemy uniform for infiltration, while Article 37 prohibits perfidy involving false pretenses that invite enemy confidence regarding protected status. The most enduring legacy of Operation Greif lies in its demonstration that cultural identity constitutes a military asset distinct from physical equipment or tactical training. The German infiltrators possessed authentic uniforms, vehicles, and weapons. They had memorized military organizational structures, ranks, and procedures. They could produce technically correct responses to formal challenges. Yet they failed to convincingly impersonate American soldiers because they lacked the unquantifiable elements of cultural authenticity. Contemporary accounts from American military police personnel emphasize that the most reliable indicators of infiltrators were behavioral rather than material. Captured infiltrators moved differently. Their posture and gait retained elements of German military bearing despite training. They responded to casual questions with formality inappropriate for American enlisted men. They lacked the casual profanity and informal manner characteristic of American military culture. The trivia questions, baseball statistics, movie stars, state capitals, were not merely random testing. They represented shared cultural knowledge that functioned as a linguistic shibboleth, an identifier accessible only to individuals genuinely socialized within American culture. A German intelligence officer might memorize that Springfield was Illinois' capital, but would be less likely to know that Springfield was often confused with Chicago even by Americans, or that this confusion was a running joke in American popular culture. This phenomenon has parallels in other historical conflicts. During the Pacific War, American forces employed Navajo code talkers specifically because the Japanese military, despite its sophisticated signals intelligence capabilities, could not recruit personnel with sufficient knowledge of Navajo language and culture to break the code. The code's security derived not from cryptographic complexity, but from cultural inaccessibility. Similarly, during resistance operations in occupied Europe, Allied intelligence services discovered that the most effective deep cover agents were not necessarily the most skilled in covert tradecraft, but rather those with the most complete cultural immersion in their target environment. An agent might possess perfect linguistic fluency, but be exposed by unfamiliarity with local customs, regional humor, or neighborhood geography. Modern military doctrine acknowledges this principle in training for occupation and counterinsurgency operations. Cultural awareness programs, emphasizing language skills, social customs, religious practices, and historical grievances, are understood as operational necessities rather than supplemental enrichment. The recognition that cultural competence affects mission success derives partly from lessons codified during analysis of operations like Greif. The counterintelligence implications remain relevant in contemporary security contexts. During the global war on terror, American forces faced adversaries who attempted infiltration of Afghan National Army and Iraqi security forces units. Authentication procedures developed to detect these infiltrators drew partly on the Ardennes precedent, testing for cultural knowledge, regional dialects, and behavioral markers that genuine members of the population would possess. When Sergeant William Creel ordered 3 men from their jeep on that December morning near Aywaille, he initiated a chain of events that would temporarily paralyze an army and permanently influence military doctrine. The immediate tactical results were minimal. 3 infiltrators captured, their mission unaccomplished. The strategic results were paradoxical, an operation that failed in its objectives but succeeded in creating chaos. The lasting legacy was doctrinal, a recognition that military effectiveness requires cultural authenticity alongside material capability. The 16 men executed for their participation in Operation Greif died for a mission that achieved none of its stated objectives. The Meuse bridges remained in Allied hands. The offensive toward Antwerp failed. Germany's last attempt to regain operational initiative in the West collapsed into defensive retreat. Whether these men were victims of unjust wartime expediency or lawful combatants who forfeited protected status through perfidy remains debated in legal scholarship. What is not debated is the operation's demonstration that identity, national, cultural, linguistic, cannot be convincingly assumed merely through material disguise. The American soldiers manning checkpoints throughout the Ardennes sector intuitively recognized what subsequent military doctrine would formalize. Authentic membership in a culture cannot be manufactured through memorization and training. It is acquired through lived experience, absorbed through years of immersion in the subtle patterns of speech behavior and shared reference that distinguish genuine cultural insiders from skilled imposters. Operation Greif failed because cultural fluency, unlike military equipment, cannot be captured, manufactured, or quickly learned. It must be earned through the accumulated experience of a lifetime. In warfare, as in all human competition, the most powerful weapon is sometimes not technology or tactics, but the simple authenticity of belonging.